All right, and we are live with my third book discussion Mentor Minutes episode. This is where I take a book, and today's book is Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And I just basically walk through the book and take out all of the things that I kind of noticed, that I highlighted, that I found interesting, and that I think could apply to frontline leaders out there. So as we dive into this episode here, and as I look for people to jump on, if you've read the book, I'd love to get your comments on it. If you're following along, I'd love to get your comments to my comments in regards to the book. So it's a wonderful book, one that I didn't necessarily expect to enjoy as much. Kim Scott is very tied in. She's been part of the Silicon Valley community for a long time, worked with Sheryl Sandberg at Google. She's worked with Apple. She's advised Twitter. She's advised Dropbox. And my concern in regards to those high flyers, she's had an internship at the McKinsey Consulting. So my concern with people that have been kind of those high flyers with those big companies is that it doesn't necessarily translate to the 98% of companies that don't run like a Silicon Valley company. One of the reasons they are so successful there is because they get so many of these management things right. And so they don't deal so much with the struggles that your standard leaders are going to deal with on a day in, day out basis. Now, that being said, I was pleasantly surprised with a lot of the takeaways, and there are a ton of takeaways in this book. It starts off talking about her concept of radical candor, and John, Patty, so good to see you here, which I'll get into in a second. But then it starts going off basically on all kinds of different things as far as employee engagement, communication is concerned, some of the common pitfalls that you're going to come across in an organization, and there are a lot of things for us to discuss. So I'm going to just start diving right into it. Again, any comments that you have, anything that rings true, anything that you'd like me to elaborate on, I'm happy to elaborate on it as well. So as we get going here, and as I set my camera up to be nice and level, or something close to level, shout out from India, 1 a.m. Prem, my goodness. Yeah, I was gonna say, you can pick up a book and get some shut-eye here. Brian, so good to see you here for this episode. So getting kind of right into it, with it. In the introduction, she hit on something, and there's a lot of just little nuggets in this book. Little one-sentence takeaways that almost don't apply to what is being discussed in the instant case here, but just really good things to kind of take with you, and snippets of leadership advice that I'd just like to call out for everybody out there. Hassan, good to see you here. So right off the bat in the introduction, every time I feel I have something more important to do than listen to people, I remember Leslie's words, "It is your job." Anna, so good to see you here. And that really gets to the heart of it. One of the main reasons that we don't listen as leaders is because we have a ton of other things that we need to be doing. We have a ton of things that are on our plate. And this really gets to the heart of it, and that is that your job as a leader is to listen to your team. And it gets to everything. It's a foundational concept for radical candor, which she talks about here. But it's just something to keep aware of, is that it is your job to listen to your team. I just posted up a snippet from my book, The Roadmap, and that is, when you listen, you learn. When you learn, you get more information. When you have more information, you make better decisions. And so there's a huge benefit for you in listening to your team. When you feel like you don't have time, remember, it is your job to listen. And it's just a great little initial takeaway from this book. So getting into the concept of radical candor. And so that is, from a high level, that is the ability to give very transparent, very real, very blunt advice to your team, and to receive it back from the team. Now, we all can, agree that that's something that is good to strive for, but the question is, how do you get it? It's really difficult to put into place. And so she identifies two key concepts that she puts on an axis that we'll get into, and that is care personally about your team member, and then challenge them directly, not indirectly. So the two factors that go into radical candor are to care personally about each and every individual of your team, and then challenge them directly. And so we'll kind of, to bear this out a little bit, the reason that you want to focus on this, and the reason it's so powerful to be able to give that direct feedback to your team and be able to receive it, is the give and take of information across what the dynamic that builds for people. So it turns out that when people trust you and believe you care about them, they are much more likely to, 1, accept and act on your praise and criticism, 2, tell you what they really think about what you are doing well and, more importantly, not doing well. Number 3, engage in the same behavior with one another, meaning less pushing the rock up the hill again and again with every individual employee. 4, they embrace their role on the team. And 5, focus on getting results. That's the goal. So as you tune into this particular episode, when we talk through radical candor, those are all of the goals. That is the benefit of putting a focus on this particular concept. Now, what holds so many people back and in leadership is that you want to be nice to your team. You want to be viewed as a good leader. You want to have people like you, for lack of a better term. What stops so many, and they call it out right here, and that is, you fear people will become angry or vindictive. Instead, what actually happens is they are usually grateful for the chance to talk it through. When you have these issues that crop up and you don't deal with them directly, you can't actually get them dealt with. And so actually having that radical candor, I think in this time and place with so much information that we have, so much spin going on with the news and how everybody deals with communication and culture, being transparent, having this radical candor is something that is refreshing for so many people. It is saying the unsaid thing in the office, and that's something that can be hugely beneficial. So I just want to tackle these comments. I'll find a good stopping place and then carry on. So Brian's comment to call out for everybody who's going to be listening to this on my podcast or seeing it on YouTube and can't see the comments as they come through. We need to be concept of challenging them, is to challenge them to be better than to be perceived to be challenging their knowledge or authority. This can lead to more authoritarian relationships and culture. Absolutely. We'll get into this. You talk about the issue, not necessarily their personal effect on that particular issue. Great comment, Brian, and absolutely that gets into the caring personally. It isn't just the challenging directly. You have to care personally. And they'll talk a little bit about what happens when you challenge people directly but don't show them that you care. That's a different type of leader, and again, we'll get into that here in a second. Sharon commented that I always believe as a manager that you lead by example. Give respect in order to get respect. Absolutely. Absolutely, Sharon. Can't disagree with that at all. It seems, the next comment here is, it seems obvious that good bosses must care personally about the people who directly report to them. Very few people start out their careers thinking, I don't give a damn about people, so I think I'll be a great boss. And that was, I like kind of that call out. We often start out caring personally. A lot of times we constantly are caring personally about the team. And what happens sometimes is some people take a different track and they care so much they stop giving that feedback. The other thing is a lot of us started out, and those that have had 1, 2, 10 years in leadership have definitely had those points where you stop caring about your team. You just want the results. You're tired of the struggle. And so it's important that to realize that to get back to those basics, to get back to that initial time that you became a leader. It's energizing all of that excitement that you have, but you care about the team. You care about getting those results. Good leaders don't care only about themselves. They care about the team, and almost everybody starts out caring about others. I like this part about trust, because that's so much of what gets built here. That radical candor, the big byproduct of that is trust. Caring personally allows people to open themselves up to trust you. Getting that feedback allows them to trust you to tell them how it is. So much of it is about trust. The hardest part of building this trust is inviting people to challenge you, just as directly as you are challenging them. And that's where we start. We'll probably get into that here. But that's often the hardest part, is saying, no, I want you to challenge me. And we'll get into some details on that here in just a second. I'm spinning through because there is a lot in this book. So when we talk about the radical candor axis, so we talk about 2 factors, caring personally and then challenging directly. She has these on an axis in the book that I won't show you because it'll be flipped around. So caring personally and challenging directly. Now, when you care personally, when you have a high level of caring personally, you have two choices. If you challenge them directly and care personally, you're being radically candid, which is the sweet spot for this particular discussion. If you care about them personally, but you don't give them direct feedback, you are ruinously empathetic. I like that. You have so much empathy for people that you are ruining them. You're not giving them the chance to succeed. And we see this all the time. Those people, when you've been nice and people are starting to take advantage of you, you see this. That's ruinously empathetic. When you've been super nice to people and you haven't given them any feedback, you don't see that they're growing. They're not improving. That's the byproduct of being ruinously empathetic. Now, the flip side of that is when you don't care personally. Those selfish bosses, those tyrannical bosses that we all have had and hopefully that we don't see in the mirror every day. When you don't care and you give direct feedback, you are being obnoxiously aggressive. These are jerks. And one of the reasons that jerks are so effective is because if you have to have a choice between caring personally or challenging directly, the benefit to the organization and the benefit from a result flows into the challenging them directly. That's what gets you results. That's what continues to improve your team. And so that's why those jerk bosses that you have been so successful, whereas those loving and caring bosses may not have been, because it comes back to that direct feedback and challenging them directly. The other thing is when you don't care about somebody personally and you don't challenge them directly, she calls it manipulative insincerity. And I just say that you've banished people basically at that point. When you don't care and you don't give them any feedback, they're in a black hole. They are forgotten about. And that's probably your worst situation possible, because they aren't going to be productive, and they're going to bring everybody else down. They're going to be demotivated as well. So one of the comments in regards to challenging directly is we don't want to be mean. We don't want people to get angry at us, that sort of thing. And the goal of being radically candid, as Kim Scott points out here, is that it's not mean, it's clear. So it may come across as aggressive, shall we say, but be careful of the label that you're putting on it. It isn't that you are being mean, it is that you are trying to be clear, crystal clear. When you are transparent, brutally honest, it isn't that you are trying to be mean, it's that you're trying to be honest in those cases. And so that's one thing, when we talk about giving direct feedback to people, that's one of the goals and one of the things that you want to have set up there. So she goes on, and we talk about this second one, this obnoxiously aggressive, and that is that I regret to say that if you can't be radically candid, if you can't both care personally about people and challenge them directly, if you can't care about them and challenge them, the second best option is being obnoxiously aggressive. This explains the advantage that assholes seem to have in the world. People may prefer the challenging jerk to the boss who's nice. Oh, no, sorry, that's the next point here. So that's what gets results. All right, wishy-washy, that's a great way of putting it. Hollow authority, obnoxious, aggressive, yes. But authority, there's a positive side to that can't be denied. There's a positive side to that ruinous empathy, is that people care about you. Ambivalence or ignorant, yes, that's great, Brian. And I'll tell the confession right now. There's been times where I have wanted an individual, because I couldn't actually get them fired, I wanted an individual to quit. And usually, again, not proud to say it, but the way that happened a couple of times for me is I banished them to that manipulative insincerity. I didn't show that I care, I didn't give them feedback, and eventually that atrophied to the point where they looked elsewhere. Again, not exactly the proudest way of handling that situation, but in the organizations that I was in, I couldn't get rid of them. I couldn't actually get them fired. Yeah, Brian brings up another point and I will bring up that particular example because I love that example and it explains this concept really well. Next comment in here is, pushes many people towards manipulation. Yes, okay, I've already covered that the fear of being labeled a jerk is what can often lead people to having that caring aspect, but not actually challenging anybody directly. Manipulative insincerity, when we talk about that black hole, banishing people, happens when you don't care enough about the person to challenge them directly. You don't care. It's not worth the time. A lot of this happens with where this comes in is with our really low performers, where we may have tried in the past to improve their performance. But instead of continuing with that and persevering with that, we just give up. And so they get banished to that particular area and don't improve. And that's just where they live. And ruinous empathy, I like this one. So when you care too much about somebody, but you don't challenge them directly. There's a Russian anecdote that she mentions in here, and that is about a guy who has an the Russian anecdote is about a guy who has to amputate his dog's tail, but loves him so much that he only cuts off an inch each day rather than all at once. I'm so glad you liked the topic, Brian. And I think that describes ruinous empathy perfectly. We care about the person so much that we don't give them the direct feedback that they need. And so we end up lengthening out the process of their development. We lengthen out the process of their failures because we're not giving them the honest truth that we should be. Bosses rarely intend to ruin an employee's chances of success or to handicap the entire team by letting poor performance slide. But this is exactly what happens. You care so much about them. It's not your intention, but because you aren't giving them the feedback, you're not challenging them, you're not giving them what they need to actually improve. And so that's where I would argue that so many people who are going to watch this video, who are going to listen to this podcast, you care about your team. You care about their success. Otherwise, you wouldn't be reaching out to improve your leadership at all. But there's a question as to whether you are giving them the feedback, if you are moving them forward, or whether you are catering to them and making their workplace just soft and cuddly. Sometimes you need a challenge. Sometimes you need a failure. Sometimes you need discomfort. Comfort is often the enemy of improvement. So if you make people a little bit more uncomfortable, they are likely to make changes and to make improvements. And we'll get into how to do that appropriately without coming across as a jerk. Slow or fast, but not deciding to do anything. Yeah, absolutely. Taking off the Band-Aid slow or fast. That should have been actually the example that was used in here. They are pleasant. The ruinous and empathetic boss, I like this description. They're pleasant to work with, but as time goes by, their employees start to realize that the only guidance they've received is good job and other vaguely positive comments. And that doesn't engender respect for anybody. And that's, and I'm just kind of looking at the next point that I have on, because there is a ton, I've dog-eared a ton of this book, because there's lots of little snippets as well as the larger points that she's making in this. The advice, and we'll cut right to it. So you want to start talking about being radically candid. You want to start giving more direct feedback to your team. The nuts and bolts of it is, my advice is to start by explaining the idea and then asking people to be radically candid with you. Start by getting feedback. Don't start this concept by giving feedback. Explain it to your team. Explain what you're looking to do. And this goes for so many things. When you look to make a pivot in what you're doing and how you're leading your team, whether you're going to start, paying attention to a particular metric, if you're going to start training in a different way, if you're going to start, be transparent as to why it is that you're doing it. Give them that information. You will get better buy-in. But you can explain this concept of being radically candid. What is the result? What does this look like? What are we going for? Why are we doing this? Explain it to them and then start with yourself. So how can I be more candid with you? How can I challenge you directly? How can I show you that I care? How do I rate? Take a blind survey on this. How do I rate in these two areas of challenging you directly and caring about you personally? Scale of 1 to 5. You can see where you need to improve. But ask your team, start with them giving you feedback and challenging you directly. And you work at that point on showing that you care for them personally. Start at that area and then work towards challenging them directly. The more firsthand experience you have with how it feels to receive criticism is such an important point. The better idea you'll have of how your own guidance lands for others. There's a comment later on in the book that I will touch on, and that is the power or the power or the effectiveness of speech doesn't stop at your mouth. it stops at the ear of the listener. Okay? And I say that again. The power and effectiveness of what you say doesn't stop at your mouth. It gets determined at the ear of the listener. Okay? So it's important that you have that firsthand experience so you understand what it's like to listen to that criticism, and it'll make you better at actually conveying that criticism down the road. Spinning to the next points. And I like this. Kim Scott spent a number of years in Apple, and so has some firsthand experience with Steve Jobs, one of those famous gurus who, I often coin the phrase, don't necessarily look to him as leadership material, not because what he did was necessarily bad, but because he was a genius at what he did. It's like looking at Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a genius. They can get away with certain things. They can do certain things and actually pull it off, where most mere mortals simply can't. And so be wary of looking to them for particular advice. But I like some of the points that she makes in here. Jobs is quoted as saying, "I don't mind being wrong, and I'll admit that I'm wrong a lot. It doesn't really matter to me too much. What matters to me is that we do the right thing." And that gets hit on a couple of times here. People who are more concerned with getting to the right answer than with being right make the best bosses. And that's, Brian hits the point there. We listen to ask and ask to understand, not to respond. But this is such a key. It doesn't matter where the right answer comes from. What matters is your results as a leader. And you are going to get results, better results, when you bring the team in, when you're communicating effectively, good ideas are coming to the surface, problems are being noticed, and people are collaborating together. That's the idea, all right? So you don't want to be in a situation where you aren't getting the right answer. You want to get the right answer. You don't want to be right. That's an important point to make. You're going to be right plenty of times as a leader. Don't worry about that. The fact that you're right 75% of the time is fine. As long as the 25% of the time that you're wrong, you're taking the advice of others. That's the key to it. And it gets hit on again, and I'll leave it a little bit later to kind of reiterate this point, because it's an important point, and it's one of the benefits to you of having a radically candid team who isn't afraid to give you that hard advice, because you will be wrong. It's inevitable that you will be wrong. The question is does somebody tell you about that? And that's what comes up over and over again in regards to Steve Jobs. There's a couple of different stories in here where they went down a particular road. They went down. Steve was arguing in meetings for particular things and wasn't, and they were debating it. They were having a fight about it, and Steve won. And then it went and failed. And what does he do? He comes back to that person and yells at them, because I guess it's Steve Jobs, and yells at them that they need to fight for their point better next time so that he's convinced to do the right thing, not the thing that was his own. So he comes back and follows up with the team members and said, hey, I needed you to be more candid. I wanted you to fight for your position because it's all about doing what is right for the organization. And I think that's a point that probably doesn't get talked about in regards to that Apple culture, is that the culture was to get things right. And sure, Steve might have been right plenty of times, but there were times when he wasn't, and he relied on the organization to follow up and make sure that they did the right thing. Liz has a comment here, and there are instances where both parties wait for annual appraisal to point out such issues. As you pointed out, this should occur frequently. Challenging directly, you should have a bias towards immediacy, and I don't know if I'm going to call it out here, but it's in the book. Absolutely. Feedback, or challenging directly, as we're talking about here, loses its effectiveness the more time that goes on and the less specific the feedback is. So you want to err on the side of being specific and giving and being timely with that particular feedback. Now, I've talked about before in typical, more normal Mentor Minute sessions, not these book discussions, about making that easier for you by also giving timely positive feedback and giving that feedback in the same way you would give normal or negative feedback. So it makes it more natural for you to be talking about things in real time with people, whether they are positive or negative, the more that you particularly do them. Joel, great to see you here. I hope you like this discussion. We are challenged to provide connective guidance for others. Feedback is kind of like screeching and covering our ears. Guidance is something we long for the message to be right in, presentation and effectiveness, and that's right. I say fingernails on the chalkboard for you, Brian, in regards to the word feedback. One of those a buzzword, and I can't stand buzzwords either, but it's a great point. You flip it to guidance. And that's why I think she's not putting feedback in there per se. She's saying challenge directly. She's changing the verbiage a little bit. And here we get to the example. Brian mentioned it in the comments here. And I love this one, where the example to describe all of the factors of radical candor are when you see, say, a colleague come out of the bathroom and they've got their fly down. Now, if you're radically candid, if you care personally about them, and if you challenge them directly on a regular basis, you whisper to them as they come out, hey, your fly is down. Now, if you don't care about them personally, but you challenge them directly, you may not go over to them at all. You may simply just shout from your desk, hey, look, his fly is down. Now, describing the other methods, going to ruinous empathy, where you care a lot about people, but you don't challenge them directly, you might be silent. You might not say anything because you're worried about their feelings. You don't want to hurt their feelings because you care about them and you don't challenge them directly. All right, that's being ruinously empathetic. And then when you don't care about them and you don't challenge them directly on a regular basis, you're demonstrating manipulative insincerity. And you're silent in those cases, and you're more worried about your feelings because you don't want to be embarrassed to be the person that tells them about it. But I like the way that this illustration, as far as a colleague coming out of the bathroom with their fly down, describes very well the different factors, and it really highlights the point that it is better to challenge directly. That was one of my big takeaways from this. Hey, I'm all about caring. Caring personally for employees was never a problem for me. It came naturally to me, and I suspect it comes naturally for you. Challenging directly is often the difficulty. And this highlights really well how challenging directly fixes the problem. It doesn't let it fester. Imagine how this person would feel if an hour and a half down the road somebody mentions, or they notice that their fly is down and they realize that it's been down for an hour and a half and nobody said anything. That's much worse than getting the feedback right away. So that's a great example I like from it. Moving on and starting to talk a little bit about motivation. One of the things that's been brought up, good to see you here. One of the things that she brings up and she talks about, so I mean, that's radical candor. She's basically covered it all in the first 40 pages of the book. And this is where I all of a sudden start checking out, because I hate books that are 250 pages long like this one, and really they could be summed up in 40 pages, but they kind of drone on and on. And so she kind of steps a little bit away from radical candor here and starts getting into some other things, but there are some valuable insights in here. And so I truthfully don't mind. It was almost like drinking from the fire hose. There's so many little snippets in here. One of the concepts that I hadn't really heard about before or heard discussed in this way is the difference between rock stars and superstars. We tend to put all of our employees in one bucket. I answer a lot of questions about employees that people think should be supervisors and should be managers and have that potential, and how do I bring that out in that particular individual? And I always advise to give them a taste of it. You know, find different projects, find opportunities for them to kind of work through some leadership traits. That's always great advice. And hey, acknowledge that some people don't want to move up into management and leadership. Kim Scott here addresses them as rock stars and superstars. Your rock stars are your high performers who love their job. Maybe they find fulfillment elsewhere, and they are the people that you can rely upon to perform on a regular basis. And on the flip side of that are the superstars. Those are those people that are ambitious. They want to take on the new projects. They want to make changes and improvements in the organization. They want that next promotion. And there's an example she calls from her experience at Google, where there were 2 Olympians that were hired at Google. And they were rock stars for 5 years. They weren't interested in moving up to management. They were interested in doing an exceptional job with what they were doing at that particular moment. And they found their fulfillment elsewhere. Now, when their sporting careers ended and they were no longer Olympians, then they turned into superstars. So identifying who wants to move up, and she talks about having candid career conversations Seeing the cast choppy. Oh, I hope you're not seeing anything. It looks clear on my end, but that occasionally happens. It'll flutter, but I didn't see any flutter on my end. But finding those superstars, having those conversations where you can understand where people want to go, what their goals are, what their mission are, so that you can put them in these particular areas, help you to manage them more effectively. And you're mismanaging them if you keep trying to stuff them into a different category. So I just like that is something to kind of think about when we talk about developing employees and working with them a little bit more. So one of the most common, I'm getting onto it here, hope so. I hope that gets fixed, Janine and Brian. I appreciate you bringing that up. Hopefully it doesn't continue to cut out too much here. One of the most common mistakes bosses make is to ignore the people who are doing their best work. Ignoring somebody is a terrible way to build a relationship. Remember, you want to keep building those relationships. That's what demonstrates that you care personally. That's what allows you to care personally, is having that relationship built that makes it easier for you to then stack on top of that some candor on it. But we do this all the time. We're focused on the poor performers or the middling performers in our operations, and we're ignoring the superstars. They'll take care of themselves. They'll be just fine. You must take the time to help the people doing the best work overcome obstacles and make their good work even better. There are sometimes some huge improvements that can be made in your top performers. You might not believe it, but you'd be surprised at some of the improvements that can be made. I talk about bringing your best performer, take your top 3 performers and bring them together in a round table and have them share their ideas, their best practices. They almost all take something from that and then improve from there. Moving from great to stunningly great is more inspiring for everyone than moving from bad to mediocre. And seeing what truly exceptional performance looks like will help those who are failing to see more clearly what's expected of them. And I think that really gets at the whole issue in regards to dealing with your superstars. Yes, you get that extra performance, but what it becomes is it becomes inspirational. Have a long sporting career in high school and in my younger years, it was always interesting to see world records get broken in, say, track and field. Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile some 50 some odd years ago, and I think it was over the next 2 years, 8 other people broke the 4-minute mile. Nobody had been able to do it for decades. But then once one person does it, people see what is possible. It breaks down some of the hang-ups they have in their head, and they're able to excel in those cases as well. So don't forget your excellent performers. They're the ones that often can lead you forward to new heights and into new areas. A great way, and this was fantastic as well, a great way to recognize people in a rock star phase, those that don't necessarily want to move up in there, is to designate them as gurus or go-to experts. I love this concept. So you have those people, and hey, I'd say do it with your superstars too. So you have those people that, hey, they might not want to be supervisors. They might not want to be managers. The other correlation I draw is my wife. She has zero interest in moving into management. She does not see that as something that looks like it's fun at all. So she would be a rock star in her particular organization. But you can still be an expert. So label people as gurus. I like to bring them into training. They can be a rock star and still train people, but give them specific areas where they can train. You can do this with people who may not be as social, may not be as outgoing as everybody else. Go ahead and give them a small nugget that they can be an expert in and they can train. I really like that, being a guru. For those people that are rock stars but don't necessarily want to move up and forward in the organization, give them some ownership over a small piece that they like and that they're great at. And that's a great way to recognize them and keep them motivated. But like most things, situation atrophy without regular touch points, lesson learned. And the other thing that happens, Janine, in regards to leaving your superstars alone, leaving your top performers alone, is what can often happen, and I know in our discussions this has happened, is you find out, you discover some things that maybe they weren't as stellar a performer as you thought they were. Once you actually get into some of the details on things, you may discover some things that aren't necessarily pleasant. So keep in touch with your superstars. Make sure you're carving out time to address them, to recognize them, to learn from them, and to look for ways that they can improve. The best way to keep your superstars happy, so you can make your rock stars happy, make them gurus, give them little projects that they can take ownership of or some sort of recognition of how good they are. But superstars are happy when you challenge them and when you make sure that they are constantly learning. And that's the big thing from a superstar perspective, is broadening out their skill sets. Yes, you want them to get deep into some of those skill sets as well. Again, training, certain special projects, whatever it is. But you also want to broaden it out. You want to give them exposure to different areas, because that informs their decision on where they want to go in the organization, where they want their next step to be. They're able to make a more informed decision, be happier with that decision, and they're going to perform better because of that. Next point is talking about firing people. So we get into day-to-day superstars. Tactical. Tactical. I almost want to say strategic as opposed to tactical as far as the superstars. But I think you might be getting into how to actually deal with them and recognize them. And I think that would probably be correct. Yeah, that would be the tactical way of handling it. But yes, great. I appreciate that comment, Brian. That really kind of rounds things out a little bit as far as the discussion is concerned. So she goes into, and again, this is like I say, where she starts going down this road of random miscellaneous advice almost. I mean, it's tied in, but just kind of loosely. She talks about firing people and when it is appropriate to fire people. And it is appropriate. It is necessary for you to let people go. She talks about sometimes where she's fired people and they've come back to her a year later and thanked her. Their spouse has forced the initial person to thank them on their behalf as well, because the marriage is better. A lot of times letting somebody go allows them to align their performance and everything else in something that they are going to be more satisfied doing and that they're going to be better doing. You aren't serving them if you keep them in a role they aren't happy with and they aren't performing in. Yes, you need to take those steps to move them forward. That's not necessarily covered here, but you owe it to them and you owe it to the rest of the team to find people who are going to be excellent at their jobs, are going to be happy at their jobs. But one of the things that's brought up, how do you deal with employee likes to start drama and gossip? I'll get to that here in a second too. Good question, Olivia. I'll just finish it off here. One thing that's brought up in regards to performance evaluations with employees and in regards to firing here, and again, it's a concept I hadn't heard of before, but I really like, and that is, have you sought out a second opinion? Before you fire somebody, have you sought out a second opinion, spoken to someone who you trust and with whom you can talk the problems through? Have you brought it up to somebody else? Not necessarily your boss. Your boss is going to okay the decision. Your boss is perhaps a little detached from the situation. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But have you talked it through with other individuals? This comes up in regards to performance reviews and the performance of employees. Bring it up with other people who you trust. Having a team, a committee, shall we say, of people who you can bring things to just to kind of validate what you are seeing. You don't always see things perfectly, simply, and in the reality of the situation. So leaning on your peers, leaning on trusted subordinates is something that's important as far as getting the right feedback, challenging people the right way, and in the case of, say, firing somebody, making sure that you're making the right decision, and this isn't something that could be turned around in some way, shape, or form. Now, the common lies that get told, and this gets back to those ruinous empathetic bosses, those that care personally but don't challenge directly. They hope that situations tend to fix themselves. They believe the best in other individuals. Some of the lies that people tell why they don't fire people is that it will get better. But we know, of course, that it won't get better unless we take action on it. We see that over and over when we look back at those situations where we didn't take action on something. Somebody, I've been in this situation, somebody is better than nobody. Hey, you can go ahead and fire that poor performer, but then it's going to be 4, 5, 6 weeks till you have somebody to replace them. Can you really survive that long? So yes, you can, but these are the lies that people tell why they don't fire people. A transfer is the answer. You know what, we'll go ahead and pawn this person off onto somebody else. Again, not something that's necessarily serving the organization as a whole. And then the comment is that it's bad for morale to be firing people. And what I've almost always found is that it is the opposite. Now, there's certain instances where, for whatever reason, you need to let somebody go who is an excellent performer and who everybody likes. But there's also times where you need to most of the time, it's a poor performer. So what I've often found is that when I've let people go, I get thank yous from their teammates. That, you know what, it's much better now, a week, 2 weeks later. It's so much better in the office right now. We're working together so much better. Retaining people who are doing bad work penalizes the people doing excellent work. And that really gets to it. When you have excellent people, when you have superstars, what you're doing is if you keep the bad people on, you are penalizing them. You are making them do more work. The example I draw all the time is your IT help desk line. We all almost have, in big, large corporations, when you have an IT help desk, we all have that one person that we like to ask for because they actually take care of business. And so what happens is you have certain individuals who are really great at their job, and then you have other individuals that are horrible. And so they don't fix anything. But what happens is they aren't actually held accountable for that, because the next time you call in, you don't want to talk to Cameron. Cameron didn't fix your problems. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and ask for Brian. And Brian's the person that fixes the problem. So all of a sudden, Brian gets buried with a ton of work because everybody's asking for Brian, because Brian actually does his work. The other people are now rewarded for their poor performance, their poor behavior, because they now don't have to do as much work. They just have to keep transferring calls to Brian. So that's one of those things when we talk about having to let people go. It's something that improves the morale in the organization. It's something that recognizes your superstars. Now, Olivia brings up the point, how do you deal with an employee that likes to start drama and gossip? And it actually gets to, I'll tie it right into the book here, Olivia, and that is, you look for a chance to institute some radical candor. I like to say that gossip and drama melts away with information. So my advice in these cases is always communicate more. If people have an opportunity to communicate more with you, with your boss, with each other in meetings, if you're mixing groups around so there's not cliques that constantly get formed, people get exposure to other individuals, that's what kills so much of that drama and gossip. Drama and gossip thrive in an environment with poor communication, or where information is simply not being shared as much. So going back to the first part of this, I'd start this video right here, right from the beginning, and start talking about radical candor, putting it out to your team. This is what we're doing. I want to show that I'm caring personally and that I'm challenging you directly, and you create that environment. This is a great template to start killing some of that drama and gossip in the organization, because that is almost always the root cause of that is a lack of information and a lack of communication within the group. And it can be top down, it can be bottom up, it can be side to side. Any of that information flow where people can prey on the misunderstandings of others is where that drama and gossip really gets going. Continuing to kind of move along, now at first blush, and so this comes back to, what I've kind of been hitting on hard, which is challenging directly. And so she'll go ahead and kind of start balancing that out just a little bit here. And at first blush, it seems like achieving results is more a matter of challenging directly than caring personally. I think I've hit that kind of hard here. But the ultimate goal of radical candor is to achieve collaboratively what you could not achieve individually. And I found that very powerful. Now, I might hit on the challenging directly because truthfully, the audience, you who are watching this right now, I trust that you care personally about your team. All right, glad you like this book. I actually liked it more than I thought I was going to, Jordan. And there's just a ton of good information here. Now, I trust that you care personally, and so I hit that challenge directly part. But what she really hits on is one of the main principles of leadership. The goal is to achieve collaboratively what you could never achieve individually. The part about caring about other people is bringing them in and making it okay for them to work together. And when they work together more, they're able to accomplish more. Your role as a leader, and where people get hung up in their first leadership positions, is they still try to be exceptional as an individual. Your role as a leader is to get the most out of your team. You personally can never accomplish as much as the 10 people put together can accomplish. So your time and your efforts and your role and your responsibility is to maximize their effectiveness. And radical candor is a way to absolutely, is one of the many things that you need to do to get the most out of your team and work with them collaboratively. So we start diving into a little bit of that collaboration. And this hits the second part. Steve Jobs talked about getting it right and getting to the right answer and not caring whether he came up with the idea or not. And so this is a discussion between Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel, and Kim talking about Steve and talking about how Steve always gets it right. All right, Steve Jobs always gets it right. That was the perception of CEOs in Silicon Valley. All the other fellow CEOs, they couldn't believe it. Now he clarifies here to her and he says, I didn't say Steve is always right. I said he always gets it right. Like anyone, if he is wrong sometimes, but he insists, and not gently either, as we talked about, that people tell him when he's wrong. So he always gets it right in the end. And that's what he was getting at. And that's where some of those stories come in. It's like if you gave in to Steve, then you were on the hook for whatever was being decided being right as well. And he would call you out on it. You know what? This turned out to be the wrong move. How did you let me make this move? How did you not convince me to go with your route? And so you could almost feel like a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But it put the onus. What that does is, from a cultural standpoint, is we are going to get the right answer. We are going to make the right moves. And if we don't, there's going to be hell to pay for everybody, because it's everybody's responsibility that we do the right thing. And if I'm coming up with an idea that sucks, you need to call it out. And I love that as a philosophy. And that's the big benefit for you in radical candor. More hands with trust make lighter the load. That's absolutely the case, Brian. But really, I like to hit on this point. You know this, you are not going to be right in your job 100% of the time as far as the decisions, the directions, the projects, the ideas that you have. You will not be right all the time. The question is those times that you're wrong, are you going to be listening to other people who do have the right idea? And that's how you can get 100% of your things right, is if you are having, as they say in the book, that radical candor, where you're having those open discussions, where you care about the other individuals, you're not afraid to challenge them directly, and you're all working towards that same goal. When that happens, when you're in that trusting environment and you can have those fights, then you're in a position to really make the right move. I know I had that personally many times. I enjoyed my relationships with my bosses where we could really, quite frankly, fight in a meeting about what to do. And I remember we scared the heck out of a brand new supervisor in a meeting because we got into it and we were yelling at each other. And then we walk out of the meeting and we're deciding where the two of us are going to go to lunch. And the supervisor's like, are you guys okay? I'm like, yeah, oh no, that was great. That's what matters, is getting the thing right. Not that I'm putting myself on the same page as Steve Jobs there, but that's where you want to be. That's the goal, is where you can trust each other, where you have that relationship where you know you care about each other, and that you're not doing it for any sort of punitive reasons. You're doing it for the overall goals of the organization. And that's where you can really make some powerful moves as far as what you're able to accomplish as a team collaboratively. And that's what they're talking about. Challenging directly is great, but you have to care personally about the individuals to be able to have some of these tough conversations that go on. Now she goes through what I consider kind of a little bit of a long-winded decision flow process here. But I did highlight a few things that I did like about it. If you read the book, this may work wonderfully for you. But I find a 7-step process a little bit laborious to go through. And I find that I'd probably myself get a little bit too dogmatic with it, and it would end up holding things up as opposed to moving things along swiftly. But she does have some great points in that, as far as listening is concerned. She brought up Johnny Ive, who is the head designer for Apple. And so he's designed the look and the feel of all of their products. Amazing industrial designer. But he has a quote in here, is give the quiet ones a voice. So you have members of your team that aren't going to be as comfortable challenging you directly, telling you when you're wrong. And you have to find a way to give them a voice and make it okay. You need to do this with your quiet team members, period. You need to be able to solicit them. I like to say that the quiet people in your office often have the best ideas because they've just been sitting back watching and listening, and you actually haven't reached out to them yet. So they often have some of the best ideas for you as well. The other part of this is actually receiving that feedback. And this was another, and like a lot of revelations, a lot of concepts that I hadn't seen put is crystal clear, and lots of just little nuggets, one sentence that almost gets lost in the larger point that she's making in this book that are just gold. And one of them is I found that they were much more likely to say what they really thought, even if it wasn't what I was hoping to hear, when I was careful to not show what I thought. You might be open to criticism. You might have no problem with it. You might not have problems with listening to different ideas, to listening to bad ideas. However, your body language can often betray what your feelings are. And so even though you're remaining quiet, you're giving off those signals. And so being able to stay neutral and listen to things in a neutral way allows people to say exactly what they're looking to do. They're not going to clue in or pick up some of those cues in you that are going to prevent them from giving you the straight scoop, and that's what you want. You want the real information. The other part of listening, and the concept of this is that ideas are fragile. I can't remember who says it in the book, but ideas are fragile, and they are most fragile in their initial stages. New ideas are fragile. That's what the word is. New ideas are fragile. And so it's important when people start coming up with ideas, concepts for you, that you take a chance to clarify them. That's a step that's in here, is clarifying. Trying to solve a problem that hasn't been clearly defined is not likely to result in a good solution. You want to give it time to develop. You want to help it develop. They go into a discussion here as far as getting people to help new ideas. At Google, I think it was, not Apple, it was Google, that actually had like a new ideas factory where you would take the idea and you would take it into this factory before it got presented as a new idea to another committee. And so the ideas were able to be clarified. They were able to be developed a little bit, and some of the natural issues with the idea would be solved and dealt with ahead of time so that it didn't just get killed mistakenly. Part of your job as the boss is to help people think through their ideas before submitting them to the rough and tumble of debate. I know I've been guilty of this in my career, is taking an idea and thinking that the debate aspect of it is what's actually going to clarify. And that's probably wrong in many instances, because that debate, it gets crushed in those cases because you're debating, you're playing the opposite side. So instead of being supportive and building it up, the other side is often looking to tear it down. And so you want an area where you can go ahead and develop those things in advance. Another great concept in here. They brought up the take responsibility and understand, okay, it isn't in here. When you are listening to people on your team, take on the responsibility to understand, to actually listen rather than putting the burden to communicate onto them. But when you are helping them to prepare to explain their ideas to others, it's your job to push your direct reports to be able to explain themselves. All right? You'll be heard more accurately if you take the time to understand what the people that are talking to you. But a lot of your ideas, and so when we have the question that comes up in these mentor minute sessions, you know what, I can't get my ideas through to my boss isn't paying attention to them, etc., etc. My advice is always make sure that you're phrasing your ideas in a way that addresses something that's important to your boss. What do they care about? What metrics are their bosses holding them accountable for? What big projects are they on the hook with the board of directors on? Phrase your ideas and your suggestions in ways that address those things, and that will help you get heard. The example that is drawn in here is one that I'll admit I'm unfamiliar with, but the great economist John Maynard Keynes was advising Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression. And so one of the issues is that Keynes couldn't get across his ideas, couldn't get the approval from FDR that supposedly, who knows, would have ended the Depression early, would have gotten the United States out of that Depression earlier. But now I saw that if Keynes's genius was locked inside his head, it may as well not have existed. It was his responsibility to make the ideas that seemed so obvious to him equally obvious to FDR. This takes that onus off of your boss and puts it on you. You need to learn to communicate your ideas. If you can't communicate your ideas in a way that makes them interesting and actionable for other individuals, then you might as well not have it in the first place. That's harsh, but a very interesting point and a very valid one, I think, too, is that you need to be good at selling your ideas. The way you sell them best is get in touch with the other parties with them. What's in it for me? What do they care about, and how does your idea address what they care about? The other thing on here, as far as getting clarity behind things, is an example she drew from McKinsey. She spent some time interning there over one summer, and that is McKinsey had very consciously created an obligation to dissent. If everyone around the table agreed, that was a red flag. Someone had to take up the dissenting voice. So you have an obligation when everybody agrees, when it seems great, somebody has to offer up the opposing view. That helps clarify ideas that seem obvious. This is totally what we should be doing. That person can be the one that brings a little bit, it may be that they don't shoot down the idea. That may not be the case, but they take it through a little bit of the crucible to purify that idea, bring a little bit more clarity, and hopefully make it a little bit better. I actually saw that the first concept I had was the movie. I didn't read the book, World War Z. That was the Israelis had a committee, and they had that actually set up that you had an obligation. It was the 12th man or something like that, where that person, if everybody agreed, if the vote was unanimous, that person had to present the opposing view to clarify things a little bit better. When we talk about decisions, so we keep going through this framework with Kim Scott here. Excuse the phone here. It'll be off here in just a second. When we talk about decisions, empower your people closest to the facts to make as many decisions as possible. And I love that. I'm a huge fan of employee empowerment. But get the people that are closest to the decision. If you're making a decision about the customer experience and how customers are moving through your store or moving through your website, then you need to get the customer support people involved. You need to get the sales people involved. You need to bring them into the decision because they're the ones that are closest to it. They're going to see the details that you can't from the 10,000-foot view. And so you need to bring those people in to make sure that you're making the right decision on things. Then moving on past the decision and moving into some of your responsibilities, she dives into, and I see, again, you see where this starts really kind of separating from that radical candor, and that's just the nature of the book. Radical candor is actually summed up in the first 40 some odd pages and then is loosely brought into some of the other concepts, but I'm very pleased with what she puts into this book. There's just a ton of great information, great little nuggets of wisdom that any frontline leader can take. I worry sometimes about leaders who have spent time in the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks, the Twitters, all of those really amazing companies, because it doesn't necessarily translate to the 99% of companies that aren't Silicon Valley unicorns. But she has some really valid points here. So she starts moving on to, relationships and building on those. So if you want to be more collaborative, you have to have good relationships with people. And she hits it right out of the park right off the bat, and that says, you can't give a damn about others if you don't take care of yourself. And we all know this. If you haven't gotten sleep the night before, then you have a short fuse and you can't make the right decisions, and you can't take care of people. If you're sick, same sort of thing. So you have to be able to take care of yourself to be able to give to others, all right? So it's even more important to focus on making time for whatever keeps you centered when you are stressed and busy than when things are relatively calm. This is a very important point with almost everything that you see from, whether it's time management, whether it's management, whether it's leadership. What happens a lot of times is you have a system in place and you have priorities and how you're supposed to do things and they work for you. But when things get stressed, we throw all of that out and we do whatever it is that we feel like doing. That crisis becomes the exception to the rule of how we work. And what you need to do is flip that thinking. And this hits on that point. When you are under the most time pressure, that's when it is most important that you are going along with your guidelines on how you do things. I talk about the first 15 minutes a lot. Taking the first 15 minutes of your day, not working with anybody else, working on your priorities. And a lot of times that'll just get thrown out or a crisis will happen and they won't do that. But it's most important during those times to stick to your plan. All right, your plan should be built to be able to deal with some of those eventualities of being sick, of having some sort of other crisis, of a bunch of people quitting, all of those things that come up in those day-to-day. That's when it's most important that you stick to your plan, not to throw it out and use the crisis as an exception. Stick with it, and that's what's supposed to help you see you through that quicker. But a really great point that was made there. If you have to use, oh yeah, I love this as far as getting your point across. And that is, if you have to use someone else's name or authority to get a point across, there is little merit to the point. You might not even believe it yourself. And I've been guilty of it in my career, and I know everybody else has been guilty at some point of saying, you know what, this is what so-and-so wants to see done. And so you're using that to get your point across as far as a persuasion element is concerned. But that's not effective. And in many cases, you may not even have bought into it if you're using that as a tool of doing that. Challenge yourself to come up with reasons, to build that sort of trust with other individuals. If you can't get your point across and it seems like a really valid point, then that's a relationship that you need to work on so that you can figure out ways to communicate better with that particular person so that they might build up some trust in you as well. When you treat people like cogs in a machine, you'll get no more than you demand, and you create an incentive to break the machine. Your employees are not robots. Many of you may have heard me say that before. They are individuals, they are humans, and that means that you're going to have to treat them differently. All right, it's nice if you can come up with standard ways of dealing with everybody, but it's not the most effective way of dealing with a team. So don't treat them like robots, treat them like individuals. It'll be easier for you to form that relationship, to show that you care when we start talking about radical candor, moving up higher on the ability to care about individuals. And that's going to be something that's going to serve you down the road in so many different ways. Trust is built on a consistent pattern of acting in good faith. Okay? Notice that it mentions acting in good faith. You made absolutely the attempt to get the person the raise. They know you did. Maybe they didn't get it, but that doesn't mean that you've lost trust with them. You've acted in good faith. Trust is something that takes time. It takes interaction. One of the best ways to improve your communication, one of the best ways to build trust, she talks about a little later, and that is having regular one-on-ones with your team. If you have a one-on-one discussion with somebody, there's nowhere else to go but to listen, to talk, to communicate, and to build that relationship. It's one of those hacks, shall we say, for building caring relationships with your team is investing that one-on-one time with them. And I like to mention with one-on-ones, because what immediately happens is people say, you know what? I've got 12 people that report to me. I don't have, it's going to take 45 minutes, an hour maybe to do these one-on-ones. I don't have time for that, even if I do them once every 2 weeks. And you're right. Maybe you don't have time to do them once every 2 weeks. But here's the thing. That 45-minute discussion when you first have a one-on-one turns into a half an hour discussion, the second one-on-one. The third one is down to 20 minutes. And by the fourth one, it's 10 or 15 minutes long unless you want to stay chit-chatting. All right, you get a lot of that stuff out during your first one-on-ones with people, and then they get quicker and quicker down the road. The other thing is, you don't have time not to have these one-on-ones. I'll go ahead and say that the flip side of that. You have to have these one-on-ones to be able to get the information to be able to manage effectively, manage the individual and manage the operation effectively. That is time well spent. As we started off here, when you feel like you don't have time to listen, realize that it's your job to listen, all right? Not to just move on to something else. Yes, all right. And continuing on here, everybody notices what kind of mood the boss is in. We have to. It's adaptive. And this gets back to leading by example. If you come in and you're pissed off at the beginning of the day, everybody's freaked out. Nobody's going to come back and give you feedback. If you come in sad, you'll lower the mood in the department. If you come in happy and with energy, people will feed off of that. It just kind of reiterates and kind of highlights what we all know as far as our effect on the team. I like this. When we talk about putting radical candor into place, all right, challenging directly, caring personally, the first step is not that you go out to your team and start giving this direct feedback. The key is that you ask them to give you the feedback. The exception to the criticize in private rule of thumb is you. You want them to criticize you publicly, so that you can show how you deal with that. When you show how you deal with it, it's going to be easier for people to emulate, and they're going to realize that it's okay for them to emulate that behavior. It's okay for others to criticize you, and that sets the expectation for everybody else in receiving criticism as well. When we talk about giving guidance, all right, and dealing with maybe critical, challenging people directly on things. Part of the question is how do you do it? And there's a very simple 3-step framework, and I like the example that was drawn in this by Kim Scott as well. And that is situation, behavior, and impact. You want to address the situation you saw, the behavior, i.e. what the person did, either good or bad, and the impact that you observed. A simple example from everyday life isn't, instead of yelling, "You asshole," when somebody grabs your parking spot, try saying, "I've been waiting for that spot for 5 minutes and you just zipped in front of me and took it. Now I'm going to be late." If you say this, you give the person a chance to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, let's move on," or "Let me move." Of course, the person might just flip you off and say tough shit. Then you can yell with some more justification, "You asshole." But doing that situation, behavior, and impact. I've been waiting for that spot for 5 minutes. You just zipped in front of me and took it. Now I'm going to be late. All right? Situation, behavior, impact. A great little 3-step process for giving direct feedback. And the points made on the next page here, that isn't just for negative feedback. The biggest issue with feedback that I see in many cases is that the positive feedback that is given isn't given in the same way as negative feedback. Use situation, behavior, and impact when you're praising people. "Hey, I've been waiting for 5 minutes. You waited, or you let me go first. I really appreciate that." Situation, behavior, impact. That's a great way of doing it. You want to phrase your praise in the same sort of manner that you phrase your criticism of individuals, and that's what helps it flow better and be more natural to give both of those. Optimize for immediacy. A couple of points that have been brought up already. The clarity of your guidance gets measured at the other person's ear, not at your mouth. That was, I mixed that up just a little bit earlier. The clarity of your guidance gets measured at the other person's ear, not at your mouth. Such an important point to make as far as is how you communicate. All of us think we communicate great. We think we're absolutely fantastic at it. But it's really not us that is the arbiter of that. It is the other person and whether they're getting the information that we're trying to give. In my experience, most bosses fear being jerks, but employees fear their bosses not shooting straight. Again, for those of you that do care personally, and what you're having trouble with is challenging your people directly, holding them accountable to the standards that you've already set, talking about the problems that you see, the improvements that they need to make. If you're having trouble with that, the fear is that you're going to be a jerk. But the other side is the fear of the employees is that the employers aren't being disingenuous with them, that they're not shooting straight. And we see this a lot, the mistrust of management. That's the fear. You fear as the leader being the jerk. Their biggest concern is that you're not going to actually tell them the truth in regards to something, and that they're not going to find out about it until it's way, way, way too late. The other thing is, in trying to be radically candid with your boss, you need to kind of make some adjustments in this case. And the main key in this is actually asking them first and foremost what their radically candid advice to you would be. So you ask it for them. You ask to get it first before you give. And then you ask permission later on. You ask permission to be able to give them some radically candid feedback. And you see how it goes. Because you want to be careful with that dynamic. Moving that upstream can be something that is a little bit difficult for bosses to take, and can have an adverse effect on your career as well. Now, when she gets into some team meetings and talking about meeting dynamics and bringing more out in meetings, and meetings as an opportunity to establish that radical candor. And one thing that they did is an exercise called Whoops the Monkey. And this is another one I hadn't seen before, but I like it very much. I've talked to individuals in team meetings, talk about one success you had in the last week, and then talk about one area of challenge that you're going to be facing that you'd love to explain and maybe get some feedback on from the team. I've talked about those two. This is a little bit cuter version of it, and it's called Whoops the Monkey. So at every all-hands meeting, they invited people to nominate each other to win the killer whale for the week. So you nominate another person for the best success of the last week. All right, not a problem. We're used to this sort of thing. That's great. The other issue was the Whoops the Monkey. So then you had to nominate other people had to not other people. You had to nominate yourself for the biggest mistake of the week. So you nominate others for successes, but you nominate yourself for the mistake. Now, I love this in this example. She tried this at Google, if I'm not mistaken. So, progressive company, not having a problem with feedback or anything like that. And it was crickets, silence. Nobody wanted to step up and admit their mistake. So what she did is she put a $20 bill next to the monkey and said, whoever, comes up with the Whoops the Monkey gets the $20 bill. So then people had an excuse to say, oh, well, I was just looking for the money. That's why I brought that up. But that is starting that that's gamesmanship on radical candor. So you're talking praise, and then you're talking about areas of improvement as well, where everybody can hear about those mistakes. It makes those mistakes, brings them out into the open. Everybody is a little bit more okay with them, and hopefully everybody learns a little bit from them as well. Next thing is talking about performance reviews, and I mentioned this in regards to firing, and it was a concept that maybe I've heard of, but it wasn't on the forefront of my mind, and that was getting feedback from others. Don't make unilateral decisions in regards to performance. In regards to firing people, get an outside opinion, and don't necessarily get it from your boss, who might be detached from the situation. Maybe it's fine to get it from your boss, but get it from a peer. Get it from a trusted subordinate. What do you think about this individual's performance? That sort of thing. Where could there be areas of improvement? Get some validation for what your opinions are in regards to their performance. On page 197 of the book, and I'll kind of move through this one quickly, but it's talking about avoiding absentee management and micromanagement. So we talk about micromanagement a lot of the time, but there is a flip side to that coin, and that's that individual that isn't in the weeds at all, who doesn't know the details, is detached and has no idea what their team is even doing. And there is a big chart here that goes through a number of instances, and you'll have to get the book. I'm not going to go through that big chart here, but there is a number of instances where you can kind of identify where you might land and where you might make improvements. And so I'll give you one example. So the absentee manager doesn't listen to people and says nothing. Micromanager doesn't listen but tells how. The partnership one is listens and asks why. And so if you find yourself in some of these areas where you might lack curiosity but pretend to know it all, that's the micromanager one, then that might be an area where you can make some improvements. So getting to the last chapter here, the ultimate goal of radical candor is to achieve results collaboratively that you could never achieve individually. Kind of reiterating our purpose here, all right? So radical candor is made up of caring personally about people and being able to challenge them directly. If you can do that, you can have a healthy relationship where people are giving information and the whole organization comes together a little bit better. She goes into a number of areas and hits really on the one-on-ones and the questions you can use and where they might be failing. Again, long lists here, so I won't necessarily get into them. But one of the things that I liked as far as team meetings are concerned. So a lot of you'll have staff meetings, management meetings, what have you. And there's a number of ways to construct those, to run the agenda for those. But I do like a couple of key things here, all right? So you're reviewing key metrics maybe, but you want to know what went well that week and why, and what went badly that week and why. And so getting into the whoops the monkey exercise, that could be a way of doing it, but really crystallizing what you're looking for from those team meetings, from those management meetings. What went well that week and why, and what went badly and why. And that really kind of crystallizes it for you. Now, getting into micromanagement, this concept that she brings up, the universe through a grain of sand. What you want to do sometimes to understand, make sure that you're not ascending up and having that 10,000 foot view and not understanding what's going on in the weeds. My advice is often once every 2 weeks that you pick some process, preferably your more common processes, and you do a deep dive. You spend an hour or 2 hours doing a deep dive, looking over somebody's shoulder while they're going through something. Asking questions, looking over a couple of people's, looking at how some other people do it. But spend an hour or 2 hours doing a deep dive into a process so that you understand it. What happens is you often find areas that could be improved. You often get surprised at some of the ways that things are being handled that you weren't aware of. And it helps you stay in touch with the organization and how it functions. And when you're still in touch, you can make better decisions for everybody down the road. So it's a great way of, I want to say, bringing some focus to micromanagement. You're not in the weeds on everything. You're picking something once every couple of weeks and getting into the weeds on that. Now, over the course of a year, you're talking about 26 different processes. You've got a pretty good handle on what's going on in the operation, pretty good understanding of the details without being overbearing for everybody. So she brings up the point, find some small problems and treat them like the universe through a grain of sand. It's a good opportunity, and what she brings up here is, so you find a small problem. Hey, Mar, good to see you here. You find a small problem, and what you're demonstrating to people is you're willing to go the extra mile to really fix it. If you're willing to go deep into it with this small problem and really ferret it out, then what is the expectation that you have for everybody else? It's leading by example in kind of an extreme way. All right? So finishing this up, and again, really like this book. If you want to put radical candor into place, there's 2 key steps here. Explain radical candor to your team so they understand what you're up to and what you're doing. So explain the concept to them. Again, doesn't take much. We're looking to care personally, have a high amount of care in our relationship, and I'm looking to challenge directly. All right, so we're being upfront, we're being brutally honest with one another, but it's okay because we know that we care about one another and about the goals of the organization. Explain the concept to them so that they understand it. And then you start by asking your team to criticize you. And the key to this is not letting them off the hook when they don't say much, because they won't at first. So, what is an area that I could improve? And they'll say nothing. You'll hear crickets. Okay, well, what about in this? This is an area that is a focus for us and that we certainly could have some improvement. Is there a way that I could be helping with that more? Well, no, there isn't. Well, now there should be something. And so you keep diving deeper and deeper. I appreciate that you don't, want to, bring it up, but, there is an area somewhere in here, and it may be an area that you know that you need improvement on. And so you start working there, but don't let people off the hook. All right. So you explain radical candor to your team, and then you offer or ask them to criticize you first and foremost. And you get persistent about that and don't let them off the hook on that. All right, find a way to get that. They will see how you react to that, and that becomes the okay. But let them know what the heck you're doing. Do this with so many of the initiatives that you want to put into place. Let them know what you're doing. Let them know why you are doing it. And when they see that importance, it's something that they can go ahead and buy into. So Radical Candor, very pleased, pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed that book. The concept of Radical Candor takes about 40 or 50 pages, and then the rest of the book is just really solid advice from a leadership perspective and some new fresh ideas that I hadn't come across before. So I really enjoyed the book. It's worth picking up. There's a ton of stories in here if you want to know some stories about how, you know, the CEOs of Google and Apple and everybody works. She was tied into all of those, and so it's a nice fresh book, good read, and it is dense. So have your highlighter and your pen out ready to take some notes, because there's some stuff that's going to come out there and pop up to you. But I'm sure that it's something that you can pull something from to improve your leadership. So with that said, I'm going to close out the book discussion for today. Next week, it is going to be The One Thing by Gary Keller, one of my favorites. So it'll be next Friday. And then after that, it is Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. And then The Culture Code by Brian Coyle, I think is who it is, The Culture Code. So those are the next 3 that are coming up. We're looking to do these every Friday. If I have something going on Friday, it might be Thursday. I think that's coming up in a couple of weeks. But hope you'll listen to or tune in to those future ones. And you can always check these out on YouTube. I'll have the link up to YouTube. These are up there on, so you can always go back and take a look at these. If you haven't read the book, it's worth a listen or a read. And then you can go ahead and listen to my comments on it to kind of bring it together. But thanks for tuning in, and I will talk to you all tomorrow. Thanks. Bye-bye.